So this time I decided to make a seam ripper, and I got this seam ripper kit from Woodcraft. This was actually, I'm making this one for my mom. I'm going to make another one for my wife as well. They're both sewers, and if you have any sewers in your family, this is a great project. You can make it in just a couple of hours, and if you're not familiar with wood turning, they have lots of these kits, probably hundreds of them. And, you know, case in point, I mean, they make great gifts. So coming up here in the video, I'll show you how I made this one on my lathe. And also be sure to check out my website at woodlogger.com, where I'll post more videos, detailed information about this project, as well as other projects that I have going on in my shop. So to get started with my seam ripper project, I have this kit that I picked up from Woodcraft, and I'll be sure to put a link out on my website at woodlogger.com where you can find that. But anyways, the first thing I did is I took the brass insert and I laid that up against my pin blank that I'm going to use. And what I'll do is I'll cut that with my miter saw, and I'll leave about 1/8 of an inch on both sides. I'll go ahead and mark this, can't see it in the video, but I'm going to cut that now, and then after that I will move on to the Okay, so I've got my blank cut to the size that I need. Next up, I just need to find the center point, and you can just use a ruler for that. I've got this handy little center point finder, which makes it kind of nice, and you just sort of lay your block in there, and it just kind of finds it for you. So anyways, I'll strike a line there, and then I'll flip it around, and I will strike another line like that. And then all I have to do now is just drill this out on my drill press. For this particular kit, it requires a size, or I guess a letter O size drill bit. And I've got one of those all set up in my drill press. So I've got the hole all drilled out in the blank that I'm going to use. I've got my brass tube that I'm going to insert, and it's just going to go in like that. There's about 1/8 of an inch gap on both sides, and to hold this in place, I'll apply some CA glue. Before I do that though, I'm actually going to take some sandpaper and rough up the brass tube a little bit so that the glue has a little something to stick to. So in this case I'm using 60 grit sandpaper, and it just kind of scores it up a little bit. And I think that'll do nice. So I'll just apply some CA glue. Yeah, maybe score it just a little bit more. And the CA glue, if you've never used it, it's basically super glue, I think. I hope. And it dries really fast though. I mean, you've got just a few seconds to kind of monkey around with it. And I put just a little bit on both sides. Slide it in. And I just kind of work it back and forth. Going a little bit, and I use a pen just to kind of push it in. So you really want to avoid getting any super glue on the actual barrel itself on the inside, or you could actually ruin your blank. But you know, it's a pretty easy process. You just slide it in, and it takes a few minutes to dry. Okay, so I've got my blank with the brass tube inserted into it. Next up, I need to use a barrel trimmer to trim out this middle section. There's a little bit of a gap between the brass tube that's on the inside and the wood that's on the surface. On this side, it's just barely a hair, maybe a 64th of an inch. So I'll just barely take a little bit off of that. On the other side, I've got maybe about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch that I'll need to trim away for that. And it's really important that you get this down as close as you can to the brass tubing, because if you don't, when you go to assemble your project after turning it, it's just going to look a little funky. So anyways, I'll use a barrel trimmer for that, and I'll do that next to my drill press. Okay, so I have my blank all ready now. I used a barrel trimmer on the ends here to clean up some excess wood. Next up, I've got these guide bushings, and for each kit that you purchase, usually there's a set of guide bushings that go with it. These are obviously the seam ripper guide bushings. But what's nice is you put these on your mandrel, and when you go to actually turn the piece on your lathe, it tells you where to stop when you're actually kind of chipping away at the wood. So anyways, you insert that there. I'll insert the other side on there. And if you have a mandrel that is not auto sized, this is actually kind of an auto sizing one. So I could space this out and put a kind of a collar at the end here. I switched over to this new thing called a mandrel saver, and I think if you don't have one, check it out. They're not that expensive, and at least in my case, I'll never go back. So anyways, it's pretty nice. It slides in, lets you get a good tight finish, and you don't have to worry about that extra net at the end of that, as well as trying to get a good spacer on there. So anyways, I'm going to turn this next on the lathe, and I'll show you how I do that next. Hey, so one quick tip before I start turning this, and I have my blank all loaded on my mandrel. It's on my lathe. I always like to use a bowl gouge to get rid of most of the wood that I need to remove. I always start with that, and then I usually move over to a skew. And when I do mine, at least for the blade guard, for the bowl gouge, I like to kind of be just sort of almost even in the middle with the piece that I'm turning. And then when I switch to the skew, I actually like to raise this up just a little bit and come at a slightly lower angle. So anyways, do whatever's comfortable for you, but that's how I do it. And anyways, I just wanted to take a minute to point that out. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I like the way it feels. It's nice and smooth. I've left just a little bit of a gap on the ends as well as in the middle, so when I go to sand, I have a little bit that I can take off there without worrying about taking too much off. So I'm going to work on sanding that next. Alright, so I'm pretty happy with the way this turned out. I left just a little bit of wood on the ends so that when I get started on sanding, I'll have some material that I can take off without fear of taking off too much on the sides. And to do the sanding, I'm actually going to work through grits. I've got this nice 5-pack of sandpaper that I worked through, and it starts at 150 and it works all the way up to 600 grit sandpaper. So I'm going to work on sanding that next, and then after that I'll work on applying a wax that I'm going to use. Okay, well, I've got my blank all sanded down. It feels really good, and I think it's going to look pretty great. Next up, I'm going to use a product called Tripoli Ultra Shine, and it's a wax made by this Australian company, and I've used this quite a bit. It's fantastic. I'll put a link out on my website at woodlogger.com where I found this and where you can pick some up. But anyways, you basically you just wipe on a little bit, you apply it, a couple coats, and you apply pressure to it, and the pressure actually heats up as it's spinning, and it makes it actually like melt onto the blank. After that, then I do the same thing with another product called Shella Wax, and I do 2 coats of that as well. Sometimes I'll do 3 if I want to make it look a little richer, but the process is the same as that. You just apply a lot of heat, a lot of pressure, a couple drops, and your blank's ready to go. Okay, so I'm ready for assembly now on my seam ripper kit. I've got my blank, it looks really good, everything's waxed up. And the first thing I'm going to do is actually apply this little cap. It'll slide through this pin holder. And there's 2 sides obviously to my seam ripper. I've got a smaller insert, and then I've got a slightly larger. and that's based on the guide bushings that I used on my lathe. The pin cap is actually going to go on the smaller side, and I'm going to use a pin press to put that together. If you don't have a pin press, you can still get that together. You just have to be a little careful because you don't want to scratch at the ends. And if you're going to do any of these types of projects, I would recommend that you get a pin press. I'll try and put a link to one of those out on my website as well at woodlogger.com. After that, I'm going to take the other side where the blade actually sits. And there are these 4 little O-rings. They look like gaskets. It's kind of hard to see in the video. But there's an indentation. There's 4 of them. And this will actually kind of hold that in place so that when you're using or not using your blade, it'll slide in like that. You can take it, flip it over, and apply it like that. And the O-rings will actually kind of help hold that in place. Okay, I've got my pin blank. I'm going to use that to get it started. Work it through. I'm going to put it on the smaller end, which is over here. And the general rule on these pin presses, at least the one that I've got, is you flip over as many of these little bars as you can so that you can open it up just as wide as you possibly can. So in this case, I've just got 3 of these open. Okay, so next up I've got my blade that I'm going to insert into this little white gasket. Actually, I guess it's not really a gasket, it's a blade holder. Okay, so next up I've got my blade. I'm going to insert it into this little white blade holder. There's a slotted end on the end where it fits, and I can slide that up until it just sort of meets the top of it. Well, that's going to show up. And next up, I'm going to insert that into the blade holder, and hopefully that screws in, and it does. So that works out pretty well. So that inserts, it allows me to change the blade as well, and that works out. So now, in theory, if I put that in there, I should be able to close it. Alright guys, so there it is. I've got my blade all assembled into the blade holder. I can unscrew this if I need to replace it. The O-rings help hold this in place. And this turned out great. So it's a fun project. It's an easy project. You can do it in just a few hours. A couple hours really. So anyways, check out my website at woodlogger.com. I'll post some more detailed information and pictures about this project and how I made it, as well as information about other projects that I have going on in my shop. And and if you're not a subscriber on my YouTube channel, hit subscribe, and that way you'll always get little updates on when I put out new videos. I'll see you next time.